Prefaces of Sophisms of the Protectionists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sophisms of the Protectionists by Frédéric Bastiat. Translated by Horace White. Prefaces. Preface. A previous edition of this work has been published under the title of Essays on Political Economy, by the late M. Frédéric Bastiat. When it became necessary to issue a second edition, the Free Trade League offered to buy the stereotype plates and the copyright, with a view to the publication of the book on a large scale and at a very low price. The primary object of the League is to educate public opinion, to convince the people of the United States of the folly and wrongfulness of the protective system. The methods adopted by the League for this purpose have been the holding of public meetings and the publication of books, pamphlets, and tracts, some of which are for sale at the cost of publication, and others given away gratuitously. In publishing this book, the League feels that it is offering the most effective and most popular work on political economy that has as yet been written, and Bastiat not only enlivens a dull subject with his wit, but also reduces the propositions of the protectionists to absurdities. Free traders can do no better service in the cause of truth, justice, and humanity than by circulating this little book among their friends. It is offered you at what it costs to print it. Will not every free trader put a copy of the book into the hands of his protectionist friends? It would not be proper to close this short preface without an expression on the part of the League of its obligation to the able translator of the work from the French, Mr. Horace White, of Chicago. Office of the American Free Trade League, 9 Nassau Street, New York, June, 1870. Preface to the First Edition. This compilation from the works of the late M. Bastiat is given to the public in the belief that the time has now come when the people, relieved from the absorbing anxieties of the war, and the subsequent strife on reconstruction, are prepared to give a more earnest and thoughtful attention to economical questions than was possible during the previous 10 years. That we have retrograded in economical science during this period, while making great strides in moral and political advancement by the abolition of slavery and the enfranchisement of the freedmen, seems to me incontestable. Professor Perry has described very concisely the steps taken by the manufacturers in 1861, after the Southern members had left their seats in Congress, to reverse the policy of the government in reference to foreign trade. He has noticed but has not laid so much stress as he might on the fact that while there was no considerable public opinion to favor them, there was none at all to oppose them. Not only was the attention of the people diverted from the tariff by the dangers then impending, but the Republican party, which then came into power, had in its national convention offered a bribe to the State of Pennsylvania for its vote in the presidential election, which bribe was set forth in the following words: Resolved, that while providing revenue for the support of the general government by duties upon imports, sound policy requires such an adjustment of these imposts as to encourage the development of the industrial interests of the whole country, and we commend that policy of national exchanges which secures to the workingmen liberal wages, to agriculture remunerative prices, to mechanics and manufacturers an adequate reward for their skill, labor, and enterprise, and to the nation commercial prosperity and independence. Chicago Convention Platform, 1860. It is true that this resolution did not commit anybody to the doctrine that the industrial interests of the whole country are promoted by taxes upon imported property, however adjusted, but it was understood by the Pennsylvanians at least, to be a promise that if the Republican party were successful in the coming election, the doctrine of protection, which had been overthrown in 1846, and had been in an extremely languishing state ever since, should be put upon its legs again. I am far from asserting that this overture was needed to secure the vote of Pennsylvania for Mr. Lincoln in 1860, or that the State was governed by less worthy motives in her political action than other States. I only remark that her delegates in the convention thought such a resolution would be extremely useful, and such was the anxiety to secure her vote in the election that a much stronger resolution might have been conceded if it had been required. I affirm, however, that there was no agitation on the tariff question in any other quarter. New England had united in passing the tariff of 1857, which lowered the duties imposed by the Act of 1846 about 50 per cent., i.e., one half of the previously existing scale. The Western States had not petitioned Congress or the Convention to disturb the tariff, nor had New York done so, although Mr. Greeley, then as now, was invoking, more or less frequently, the shade of Henry Clay, to help reestablish what is deftly styled the American system. The protective policy was restored, after its 15 years' sleep, under the auspices of Mr. Morrill, a representative, now a senator, from Vermont. Latterly I have noticed in the speeches and votes of this gentleman, who is, I think, one of the most conscientious, as he is one of the most amiable, men in public life, a reluctance to follow to their logical conclusion the principles embodied in the Morrill Tariff of 1861. His remarks upon the Copper Bill, during the recent session of Congress, indicate that, in his opinion, those branches of American industry which are engaged in producing articles sent abroad in exchange for the products of foreign nations are entitled to some consideration. This is an important admission, but not so important as another, which he made in his speech on the national finances, January 24th, 1867, in which, referring to the banknote circulation existing in the year 1860, he said, "And that was a year of as large production and as much general prosperity as any, perhaps, in our history." If the year immediately preceding the enactment of the Morrill Tariff was a year of as large production and as much general prosperity as any in our history, of what use has the Morrill Tariff been? We have seen that it was not demanded by any public agitation. We now see that it has been of no public utility. In combating, by arguments and illustrations, adapted to the comprehension of the mass of mankind, the errors and sophisms with which protectionists deceive themselves and others, Bastiat is the most lucid and pointed of all writers on economical science with whose works I have any acquaintance. It is not necessary to accord to him a place among the architects of the science of political economy, although some of his admirers rank him among the highest. It is enough to count him among the greatest of its expounders and demonstrators. His death, which occurred at Pisa, Italy, on the 24th December, 1850, at the age of 49, was a serious loss to France and to the world. His works, though for the most part fragmentary, and given to the public from time to time through the columns of the Journal des Economistes, the Journal des Débats, and the Libre Exchange, remain a monument of a noble intellect, guided by a noble soul. They have been collected and published, including the Harmonies Economiques, which the author left in manuscript, by Guillaumin and Co., the proprietors of the Journal des Economistes, in 2 editions of 6 volumes each, 8vo and 12mo. When we reflect that these 6 volumes were produced between April 1844 and December 1850 by a young man of feeble constitution, who commenced life as a clerk in a mercantile establishment, and who spent much of his time during these 6 years in delivering public lectures, and laboring in the National Assembly, to which he was chosen in 1848, our admiration for such industry is only modified by the thought that if he had been more saving of his strength, he might have rendered even greater services to his country and to mankind. The Sophisms economiques, which fill the larger portion of this volume, were not expected by their author to outlast the fallacies which they sought to overthrow. But these fallacies have lived longer, and have spread over more of the earth's surface, than any one, a priori, could have believed possible. It is sometimes useful, in opposing doctrines which people have been taught to believe are peculiar to their own country and time, to show that the same doctrines have been maintained in other countries and times, and have been exploded in other languages. By what misuse of words the doctrine of protection came to be denominated the American system, I could never understand. It prevailed in England nearly 200 years before our separation from the mother country. Adam Smith directed the first formidable attack against it in the very year that our independence was declared. It held its ground in England until it had starved and ruined almost every branch of industry, agriculture, manufactures, and commerce alike. It was not wholly overthrown until 1846, the same year that witnessed its discomfiture in the United States, as already shown. It still exists in a subdued and declining way in France, despite the powerful and brilliant attacks of, say, Bastiat and Cavalera, but its end cannot be far distant in that country. The Compton-Cavalera treaty with England has been attended by consequences so totally at variance with the theories and prophecies of the Protectionists that it must soon succumb. As these pages are going through the press, a telegram announces that the French government has abolished the discriminating duties levied upon goods imported in foreign bottoms, and has asked our government to abolish the like discrimination which our laws have created. Commercial freedom is making rapid progress in Prussia, Austria, Italy, and even in Spain. The United States alone, among civilized nations, hold to the opposite principle. Our anomalous position in this respect is due, as I think, to our anomalous condition during the past 8 or 9 years, already adverted to, a condition in which the protected classes have been restrained by no public opinion being too intensely preoccupied with the means of preserving the national existence to notice what was doing with the tariff. But evidences of a reawakening are not wanting. There is scarcely an argument current among the Protectionists of the United States that was not current in France at the time Bastiat wrote the Sophism Economique. Nor was there one current in his time that is not performing its bad office among us. Hence his demonstrations of their absurdity and falsity are equally applicable to our time and country as to his. They may have even greater force among us if they thoroughly dispel the notion that the protection is an American system. Surely they cannot do less than this. There are 1 or 2 arguments current among the Protectionists of the United States that were not rife in France when Bastiat wrote his Sophism. It is said, for instance, that protection has failed to achieve all the good results expected from it, because the policy of the government has been variable. If we could have a steady course of protection for a sufficient period of time, nobody being bold enough to say what time would be sufficient, and could be assured of having it, we should see wonderful progress. But inasmuch as the policy of the government is uncertain, protection has never yet had a fair trial. This is like saying, if the stone which I threw in the air had stayed there, my head would not have been broken by its fall. It would not stay there. The law of gravitation is committed against its staying there. Its only resting place is on the earth. They begin by violating natural laws and natural rights, the right to exchange services for services, and then complain because these natural laws war against them and finally overcome them. But it is not true that protection has not had a fair trial in the United States. The protection has been greater at some times than at others. That is all. Prior to the late war, all our revenue was raised from customs, and while the tariffs of 1846 and 1857 were designated free trade tariffs to distinguish them from those existing before and since, they were necessarily protective to a certain extent. Again, it is said that there is need of diversifying our industry, as though industry would not diversify itself sufficiently through the diverse tastes and predilections of individuals, as though it were necessary to supplement the work of the Creator in this behalf, by human enactments founded upon reciprocal rapine. The only rational object of diversifying industry is to make people better and happier. Do men and women become better and happier by being huddled together in mills and factories, in a stifling atmosphere, on scanty wages, 10 hours each day, and 313 days each year, than when cultivating our free and fertile lands? Do they have equal opportunities for mental and moral improvement? The trade unions tell us no. Whatever may be the experience of other countries where the land is either owned by absentee lords, who take all the product except what is necessary to give the tenant a bare subsistence, or where it is cut up in parcels not larger than an American garden patch, it is an undeniable fact that no other class of American workingmen are so independent, so intelligent, so well provided with comforts and leisure, or so rapidly advancing in prosperity, as are agriculturalists. And this notwithstanding, they are enormously overtaxed to maintain other branches of industry, which, according to the protective theory, cannot support themselves. The natural tendency of our people to flock to the cities, where their eyes and ears are gratified at the expense of their other senses, physical and moral, is sufficiently marked not to need the influence of legislation to stimulate it. It is not the purpose of this preface to anticipate the admirable arguments of M. Bastiat, but there is another theory in vogue which deserves a moment's consideration. Mr. H. C. Carey tells us that a country which exports its food, in reality exports its soil, the foreign consumer not giving back to the land the fertilizing elements abstracted from it. Mr. Mill has answered this argument, upon philosophical principles, at some length, showing that whenever it ceases to be advantageous to America to export breadstuffs, she will cease to do so; also, that when it becomes necessary to manure her lands, she will either import manure or make it at home. A shorter answer is, that the lands are no better manured by having the bread consumed in Lowell, or Pittsburgh, or even in Chicago, than in Birmingham or Lyons. But it seems to me that Mr. Carey does not take into account the fact that the total amount of breadstuffs exported from any country must be an exceedingly small fraction of the whole amount taken from the soil, and scarcely appreciable as a source of manure, even if it were practically utilized in that way. Thus our exportation of flour and meal, wheat and Indian corn, for the year 1860, as compared with the total crop produced, was as follows: Total crop: flour and meal, barrels, 55,217,800. Wheat, bushels, 173,104,924. Corn, bushels, 838,792,740. Exportation: flour and meal, barrels, 2,845,305. Wheat, bushels, 4,155,153. Corn, bushels, 1,314,155. Percentage of exportation to total crop: 5.15, 2.40, 0.39. This was the result for the year preceding the enactment of the Morrill Tariff. It is true that our exports of wheat and Indian corn rose in the 3 years following the enactment of the Morrill Tariff, from an average of 8,000,000 bushels to an average of 46,000,000 bushels, but this is contrary to the theory that high tariffs tend to keep breadstuffs at home, and low ones to send them abroad. There is need of great caution in making generalizations as to the influence of tariffs on the movement of breadstuffs. Good or bad harvests, in various countries, exercise an uncontrollable influence upon their movement, far beyond the reach of any legislation short of prohibition. The market for breadstuffs in the world is as the number of consumers, that is, of population. It is sometimes said in the way of reproach, and it is a curious travesty of Mr. Carey's manure argument, that foreign nations will not take our breadstuffs. It is not true, but if it were, that would not be a good reason for our passing laws to prevent them from doing so; that is, to deprive them of the means to pay for them. Every country must pay for its imports with its exports. It must pay for the services which it receives with the services which it renders. If foreign nations are not allowed to render services to us, how shall we render them the service of bread? The first series of Bastiat's Sophisms were published in 1845, and the second series in 1848. The first series were translated in 1848 by Mrs. D. J. McCord, and published the same year by G. P. Putnam, New York. Mrs. McCord's excellent translation has been followed, by permission of her publisher who holds the copyright, in this volume, having been first compared with the original in the Paris edition of 1863. A very few verbal alterations have been made, which, however, have no bearing on the accuracy and faithfulness of her work. The translation of the Essay on Capital and Interest is from a 12th volume published in London a year or two ago, the name of the translator being unknown to me. The second series of the Sophisms, and the essay entitled Spoliation and Law, are, I believe, presented in English for the first time in these pages. H. W. Chicago, August 1st, 1869. End of Prefaces. Recording by Katie Riley. March, 2010.